everybody. Welcome to WoNoMute. We are starting this new season with, again, new challenges and risks that we will explain now. But basically, yeah, just wanted to first thank NTNU and University of Oslo and MCT. Thanks to their support, we are able to run this seminar series. And how does this work? So we have audience here in Trondheim. Welcome. We do also have audience in Oslo. And because it's, Sepehr will explain later, but usually we're in real time, but now, well, they are connected through YouTube channel, but we can say hi to Oslo, and then we'll be facilitating the session there. But as you can see, there is some delay, so they might kind of react in 10 minutes or 10-second time. So Jan is in the back, and she will facilitate the session. And also we have online viewers on YouTube. So as you can see already, it's quite a complex system. And well, we have Sepehr as a representative of the MCT students to explain the nature of this complexity. So Sepehr? Yeah?
So yeah, we all know WoNoMute is an event that aims to promote and connect the work of women in music tech at local, national, and international levels. For that, communication on a high level of standards is a crucial matter. As a team, thanks to efforts and teamwork between MCT's first year and second year students and also the teachers, both in Oslo and Trondheim, during several days, we have managed to achieve our goal and conquer all the complications and challenges to some extent. As it can be observed, this presentation is going to be performed both in Oslo and Trondheim via an ambisonic multi-channel playback system, and also will be streamed online using a binaural playback system in order to provide the spatial experience for the online viewers. That, alongside video production, including multiple video sources, all have been set to create a high-level audiovisual experience for the audience both in Oslo and Trondheim and all around the world, actually. So, as you know, because of the complexity of this sort of setups, there might be some issues time to time popping up. The thing is, regarding our computer that we're using to send the sound from here to Oslo in a multi-channel way, there have been this driver issue. So we can't actually send it to Oslo in multi-channel. So what we decided to do is to have the Oslo experiencing the stream, which is being played back in binaural. So they will have it in, the multi-channel, spatial audio experience, but in binaural, actually playback system. Yeah, that's the thing.
And now we will introduce our first speaker of the season, very special visit by Natasha Barrett. Natasha Barrett is an internationally awarded British music composer based in Norway for many years, specializing in ambisonics, 3D sound, and electroacoustic music, who did her master's degree in analysis and electroacoustic composition at the University of Birmingham, studying with John T. Harrison and working with BEST, this Birmingham electroacoustic sound theater system. Then Natasha did her doctoral degree in composition supervised by Dennis Smalley at City University in London. She is currently co-director of the Norwegian Spatial Music Performance Ensemble and founder of 3DA, the Norwegian Society for 3D Sound Art. She currently holds a professorship at the Norwegian Academy for Music in Oslo. Please give a warm welcome to Natasha Barrett. Thank you.
Okay, so the title of my talk, Images in Space and Tangible Sound, actually. I thought I'd give a little bit more background about my musical background. First of all, so you know really where I'm coming from and what I'm focusing on in this presentation. So I'm a composer, and I compose acousmatic music, work with live electronics, work with scored works for performers. I work with sound installations, many of them are interactive. I'm also a researcher, and I work with performance. I'm riding many horses simultaneously. But what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is how I work with space and how it is an integral musical element that has infiltrated all of my work, really, since I ventured into electroacoustic composition back in 1994. And the focus here will be my work in higher-order ambisonics and how I use that to create images in space, and how these images draw on real-world features to do with their spatial disposition and how they behave spatially, even if the sound itself is actually quite abstract, or the sound source itself is abstract. Now, I'm going to work for a PowerPoint presentation, first of all, and as PowerPoint doesn't really like multi-channel sound very much, I'm then going to quit the PowerPoint and go into some nice examples, which hopefully will run smoothly in Max. And the presentation is in 2 parts, and so then after I've done the first section, hopefully I've got time to jump back into PowerPoint and unfold some more detail, which moves into a slightly different direction, again with sound examples. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on. The first thing that I have realized I'm always thinking about is our perception of spatial sound images and how that connects to our real world. And so I need to first then think about sound propagation. And when I'm thinking about spatial sound, I need to understand that all frequencies propagating from a single point in space is highly unlikely. And in fact, different frequencies may propagate in different directions from surfaces, from volumes, from cavities of the item that makes the sound. And this creates a very complex directivity pattern, and this is what's normal. Also, I have to understand that sound waves interact with the environment and with the listener, both in distance and orientation. That's all about acoustics, really. Now we start moving into music as well. Sound image behavior. Sound sources often move and behave in some way, which is extending acoustics a bit further. And sound images often have an identity. And this may involve what we think the source is, and how it was produced, or what action stimulated that sound. And that a clear identity may dictate what we think where we think the sound is located, than rather where it actually is located. So, for example, if you hear the sounds of footsteps and you think they're walking towards you because they get louder, and maybe the frequency changes, because that is such a clear and salient identity, spatially they might actually be standing still in space and not moving at all. But because of those extra cues, we think it's moving. And we can turn that on its head as well and think of it the other way around. So we need to think about how the identity of the sound interacts with our assumption about what it's doing and where it is. And that is particularly important because if we're then working with abstract sound sources which don't have a clear identity, we've really got to think about how we're processing and designing the spatial information, because there's nothing else to tell us where it is, how it is behaving, what it is doing, and what its musical meaning is. So, space is an important musical parameter. It isn't something, of course, I've invented. It's something which has been around and developed for decades. And what this has led to is a number of spatialization options that are available to us. The first, which I'm going to mainly talk about, is ambisonics, based on 3D spherical harmonics. We also can use VBAP and DBAP and other extensions of 3D panning techniques. We can work with wave synthesis. We can work with binaural and transaural methods, and we can work with normal channel-based methods. Now, what all of these methods have encouraged composers to do is to work with sound as points in space, moving points along a trajectory, or trying to find a way to spread that sound. Now, in my first slide, I pointed out that real images in space are not single points. Images have a size, they have a dimension, they have a sense of behavior and movement. But our tools are encouraging us to work with single points in space. And I'm trying to find a way to move into the real world of spatialization, or connecting to our understanding of space in the real world, and trying to move away from this problem of the point in space. So, if we're thinking then about points as images, what can we do? Well, one thing, technical thing to mention, because this has implications later for my sound examples, is the concept of ambisonics blur. Now, ambisonics blur is the natural spread of a point source in ambisonics when you're decoding. And in very high-order ambisonics, this blur is very narrow, or the source is very directional. And that's one of the great reasons for using very high-order ambisonics. So high-order ambisonics, you get a much greater resolution in terms of azimuth than you do with lower-order ambisonics, where you get more of a blur. But of course, the more directional the source is, the more problem you get of it hearing a point in space and not a sound image. So there are these trade-offs going on here. The other advantage of higher-order ambisonics is that you get a much larger listening area for the audience, which I'm not going to really talk much about, but of course that's really important if you're a composer and you want to make music for a concert hall for many people to listen to at the same time. Now, to try to get over this problem of the point, we find various different solutions to widening that image. So there are different kinds of what are called ambisonics blurring, to take a source and to spread it. And you can control this in real time. The problem, though, is that the spreading techniques spread the sound uniformly. Now, we already have seen, or I've already mentioned, that frequencies propagate in different directions, in different intensities. And so, in real world, the spread of an image has an enormous amount of spectral variation. It's not constant. It has an enormous amount of temporal change if it's moving, as it's moving closer and further away, for example. There are many things that change. Spreading techniques don't account for these changes and these differences as the image gets larger, as the image gets closer, as the image goes further away. So, the next thing I want to consider are the differences between space in reality and space in composition. I've already mentioned that sound images in reality are extremely complex. But how much of that do we really need to consider in composition? If we consider every single feature, we'll be spending all our life designing our sounds, not really getting on with the composition. So at some point, I have to work out where is the level of redundancy. And again, I come back to perception. I'm interested to know how much of the real world are we, in fact, sensitive to in the acousmatic context. If you're not familiar with the word acousmatic, just for now, let's say that's listening to sound without seeing the source that made it, or seeing a visual stimulus to tell you where the source came from. And we can think of first the azimuth or the angular difference. Now, our perception of angular difference, this varies significantly depending on the angle and elevation of the sound in relation to our head. Now, that means you could say, oh, well, then we can say that when the sound is in the front, where we're very sensitive, we have to be very careful and be very precise. And when it's maybe towards the sides or towards the back, we can be less precise. Unfortunately, this doesn't really hold true because listeners move their heads. So we have to think about precision in all angles and azimuths. However, our perception of distance, this is less precise in direction. So maybe we've got some leeway here. But then if we move on to spectral and temporal variations, our perception of spectral and temporal variations are more refined than distance and direction. So we can use these things, spectrum and tempo, or temporal variation, to help us project angular difference and distance difference. So use the things that we are very sensitive to, which are actually quite easy to control, to help us to control these other parameters which are trickier. Now, I wasn't sure if I'd drop this in, but I am, and I want to just quickly ask people in the room, do you know who Pierre Schaeffer was? A few nods, good, right, so that's great. Well, he had the many things, great things that he said, and one of the things he discussed was the idea of allure. Now, allure is the unique character of the sound defined by the way the material behaves, or defined by the material and the way it behaves. And allure is about revealing the energetic agent's way of being, and very broadly, whether this agent is living or not. And Sepehr says, we first perceive the general profile of the sound, then the nature of the allure, and then afterwards become aware of the presence of a microstructure, which he terms grain. Now, for Sepehr, the idea of developing space in his music, at the end of the day, the tools that he has available to him are so far divorced from what we have now. We can't really get into what ideas he could have had about space. However, we can think of allure as a spatial idea now in our compositions, because allure can be extended, and we can say that the acousmatic object as a spatial image can be characterized by the manner in which the energetic agent's way of being and movement behaves in space. So taking his ideas and saying, well, now we're going to think of this as a spatial parameter, not just a spectral parameter, which is really what he was talking about. He was talking about spectrum and time. We can now also talk about space. And for me, this is very important, because it means that I can take an abstract sound, and although the listener doesn't hear footsteps, birds, or concrete sources, the listener can explore real-world connections through allure, or the way the sound is energetically behaving in space. And this will draw on our sensitivity to spectral and temporal information and encourage our perception to engage then in the way it interacts spatially. Okay, now, I'm going to go back. One thing I haven't added here is that allure, it translates approximately to the word gate in English. Gangle, maybe in Norwegian. Gangle, thank you. So if you think of somebody that you can't see their face, but you know it's them by the way they're walking. That's what I'm interested in. How we can understand the unique character of an object by the way it's moving, even if we don't actually see its identity at close-up and really say that's who it is because we recognize the face or we recognize these other types of features. Okay, so let's get on to some specifics. How can I then project spatial images in higher-order ambisonics without falling into the trap of moving a point source around? So what I'm doing is that I'm building an image from a number of component sources. And each source reflects one aspect or angle of the final image. So you could say if you've got an object and it's propagating frequencies in all directions, I will build up a fake object by saying this source, point source here contains certain frequencies with certain phase. This one here contains other frequencies with another set of phases. And so I'll build an image, and that image will also interact with environmental cues, for example, directionality in the reverb, other environmental cues from the environment in which the source is placed. About these sources, they need to have some things in common. Because if they're all different, you just hear a cloud of different point sources moving around. So they have to have some commonality. But they can't all be the same, because then it will collapse into a little blur again. So they need to have some commonality in spectrum, but they need to have a different yaw, which is the rotation of that component image. Does my mouse work there? Yes, it does. There. So the rotation of this, these are all different. There will be textural and dynamical variation and motion behavior variation. And I'm going to skip over that, maybe come back to that. So what we can now do, we've got our image made up of our points. Now we're in a very convenient compositional situation, because all we need to do is to translate this with a Cartesian movement. And as the image moves further away, the width of the image will scale correctly as it does in reality. As the image moves further away, ambisonics blur will start to blur those sources and again start to mask then detail in temporal variation, spectral variation of the internal components. So all the things that happen in reality, when a real sound source moves away from you, we can now very easily recreate simply by a Cartesian translation of this complex image. When it's close up, we hear all the details. When it's further away, they would naturally be blurred. They would naturally scale in the correct way. Okay. So then we've got to decide, okay, well, this kind of works, but how many sources or components do we need when we're going to build up this image? This is a factor of ambisonics blur, so if you're working very high order ambisonics, you're going to need more points than if you're working in lower order ambisonics. If we want the image to be very close to the listener, then we're going to have more points. Of course, if you have a few points, we're going to hear this angular difference. The blur isn't going to hold it together, and it's going to fall apart. However, I haven't resolved on an absolute number, and I don't think that's possible, because I think this is something where the composer has to make decisions based on the content of their sound to start off with. I have been trying to find a way to work with this using different kinds of music information retrieval and AI-type processing techniques with iterations of vast quantities of sound banks to find a method and to find a rule. I haven't really got very far yet. There's a potential maybe for a big research project in that area. But it's not something which is very easy to pluck out of the box. And at the moment, everything I do needs to be handcrafted. Okay, so at that point, I can now move out of my PowerPoint and play some sound examples. So these are just examples made for a class situation to try to be clear. And then when I've played through a few of them, I'll see if I can dip into the center of a composition, and you can maybe try to hear them in context. So let me see. If I now bring up, I'm going to show you a very simple viewer. This is, I'm using SPAT. And all these max patches that I have were made actually pre-SPAT 5, so some of these go back quite a long way. So this is a SPAT 4 viewer, if you recognize the difference between SPAT 5 and 4. And maybe I should show you my slightly messy max patch is also pre-MC Connect, so I've got all these wires everywhere. Let's not worry about that. So check I've got all my gains set up. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a complex image made from 12 component sources, and it's going to move towards you. It's going to move around a bit. It's going to move away. Now, just about your listening area, Andreas, you're sitting in the middle, you're probably very happy. Guys sitting at the back, maybe. In Oslo, you're lucky if you've got headphones on, or are you on loudspeakers? Are they on loudspeakers or headphones now in Oslo? I mean, stereo loudspeakers or 8 channels?
They will only have the binaural, so they should have headphones.
Okay. All right, well then Oslo, you're in the worst possible listening situation, I'm afraid, because you're going to be listening to binaural over 2 loudspeakers, which is not what you do. So I would really encourage you later, if you get access to the stream, just to go back and listen to the sound examples on headphones, because the binaural is great, because I'm using a very nice binaural transcoder. So go back and check them out, and then it will make more sense. Okay, so here's the first example. And let's check I've got my OSC switched on. Yes, let's cross fingers, this is going to work. Okay, there's the cluster of sources. Okay, so you could see that if I just quickly drop back in here, if I zoom in, so you can see that here's my sources. I've got 12 of them. That's how it looks like in Spat Viewer. I'm actually using Spat Opera to make it fast at the example. You can pick that apart, but what Spat Opera does, it works with a room simulation for you. So each of these sources, the white halo shows you the yaw, or the direction of face. So if this is the listener, if it's facing away from you, you're going to get a reflection of more of the environmental cues, in this case a reverb model, than the sound coming at the back, which would be filtered with a low-pass filter. And so they're all facing different directions. I've decided on the direction based on the sound that I'm putting into each of those sources and built up the image like that. You can, of course, pick this apart. You don't have to use Spat Opera. You can pick it apart and then control everything internally. But this is a very quick way of getting something out of it to start off with. So I hope you heard something was moving around. You hope you heard it got close. As it got closer, it got bigger. You heard more detail. It moved away. It got a bit more blurry and cloudy. OK. Now, in the next example, one of the... actually, I'm going to pop back into this power presentation. Oh, let's move the Spat window off there so you can see what my presentation is. Now, what do we do if the difference between the component sources isn't sufficient to make the image? Now, you heard there was a lot of texture, a lot of stuff going on in that sound example, so it was an easy sound. Well, what if the sound materials don't have that much difference? Of course, we can then add difference very easily. We can, for example, jiggle them around, make each of those little sources move a little bit. Not too much, otherwise the image falls apart, but just enough to give that image some kind of internal motion behavior. And so one of the things I like to do is to control the little jiggling around of the source based on some element of that actual sound input. So I might track the amplitude difference or the spectral difference and then use that information to modulate spatial movement. So there's a correlation. So if you have a large volume change, of course, the spatial movement's going to also jump faster than if there's a small volume change. Finding some way to correlate the perturbation of the sound based on the spectral content. So I'm going to jump out of that again, because it luckily hasn't crashed, which is good, and come back into my sound example. So in this example, I'm going to reveal some new sources. And if you bear with me, reveal 1 to 4 and remove the others. So let's see what we've got now here. OK. There's a bit more than 4 there. Let's get rid of some of the others. There we go. Right. So I've got just 4 source sounds in my image. And you're going to hear in a moment that they are very similar, and it's quite a, well, let's just play it and you can hear. Oops, disappeared off screen. There. Okay, so you got the idea it was getting closer and bigger, but the actual differentiation, the clarity of the image was nowhere as clear as the first example. Of course, it's a different kind of sound, but what if I want to try to make it clearer? Well, now in this next example, I'm just going to turn on a spectral tracking. Let's turn that envelope follower. Oops, move that over here. And where is example 2b, which is here we go. So I'm hoping that my CPU isn't going to start complaining, and I'm hoping you're going to see those little guys jiggle around and also hear a difference. Oh, they're not jiggling around. Hold on, let's see if I can make them jiggle. This does tend to happen when I'm driving a bit too much CPU. Let's see, are they jiggling now? No. Try once more. No, that's a real shame. I fear that I've got too much CPU to do that example, so I might actually just try once more and then move on. Try once more here. No, okay, unfortunately that example isn't going to work, which is the problem of doing everything in real time, I suppose, and not rendering them. Okay, well, what you should have seen are those little sources jiggling around a little bit, and as they get closer, you'll hear that they are moving and creating a slightly wider and clearer sense of image. Okay. I think the last example, which I'll play, is simply what we can do by widening a static image, which is probably going to be this one here. And for this, I'm going to manually place the sources in front of us. So I'm going to stick this over here so you can see what I'm doing. So that's the old SPAT opera from the old days before SPAT 5 came out. And I'm just going to make these sources, just 4 of them, in front of us. So it's exactly the same sound input as the first example. I've just got 4 sources close up so you can hear how wide that can be. And I'll just manually move them further away. So you see how simple the translation aspect is. Okay, and then I'll move them away. Okay, so very simple ideas. And that recording was just a straight sound recording. So there's no extra processing. It's quite a good recording, I think, but it is a straight sound recording without any extra processing. So one doesn't have to send your sound files through enormous recursive processing techniques to be able to work in this way. Okay, so let's put this in context, because these separate sound examples can be a little bit boring on their own. And I believe I'm going to now drop in the middle of a piece called Dusk's Gate, which is a piece I composed last year, which uses many of these techniques. There's a lot going on in this example, this extract, which is why I don't play it to start off with. You've now seen some of the techniques, but how they can then be brought into the composition. And I think that it's loaded, so I should just be able to press Seek, which will drop me in the middle. going to stop that example there. So, I've just got the 10-minute flag, so I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint presentation because one moment. Okay, so in Trondheim, what I'm doing here is that I'm loading a new max patch and a new load of sound files so that I can quickly do a new PowerPoint. Going to get that in just a moment.
Yeah, it's fixed with Oslo. Oslo is.
They're on multi-channel, are they?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
They managed to do it exactly when you started the first example.
Oh, marvelous. Okay, now hold on, I've got to launch new window. Okay, good, so also now knows what I'm doing, that's fantastic. And I'm going to open this session, which I've made especially for this class, which is probably going to come up over there, which I'm going to move, because I don't want you to see that, because that's secret. If you hadn't already worked out, the way that I'm working is that I'm using a front end I'm using Nuendo at the moment, but I might use Reaper, and then I'm doing all the spatial audio encoding and decoding stuff in Max in the background, because I find that's just a much nicer way to have all the flexibility that we really need without being put into a box by the commercial world of digital audio mixing. And now Oslo should have me back. I hope so. Hope somebody could say yes. Good.
Yeah,
Right,
we
excellent. So, and now I go back to my PowerPoint and open a few more slides and then finally get a few more sound examples. Okay, so now, the next thing is that what I've been showing you so far is how to build up an image from component sources. Well, we can take it from the opposite side. We can say, we have an extremely complex sound environment from the real world, and we want to decompose it and take things out that are interesting, which I'm calling the decomposition and recomposition of the soundscape. And this ties into a research project which I'm now starting in Oslo, but I've been working on like this for a couple of years, starting to develop the ideas. Now, let's just think about environmental recordings. A lot of composers use environmental recordings in their compositions. A lot of sound artists use environmental recordings. And one of the problems, one of the lovely things about using environmental recordings is that we can understand the identity of the sounds in situ. Our memory connects to the place we recorded the sounds change over time. We also have to think about acoustics and perception, just as in my first part of the presentation. We have to think about how sounds propagate through space, and this time more with respect to how it interacts with environmental acoustics in particular. So these are all very important things we need to think about in our sound recordings. But stereo recording techniques are loaded with problems. It really just captures the sound field with left and right and some depth. It's very difficult to pick apart the spatial information in a stereo recording. The image is also very unstable, depending on whether you are moving to the left or right. You've got one sweet spot in the center of two loudspeakers where you get the phantom image. And one of the basic problems for a composer is that you've got a recording, and what do? You take out a chunk of it, you put another chunk of it together, you maybe transpose it, you mix it, but you're essentially locked to always having this complex recording and collaging it or montaging it in some way. Yeah, well, we've been there and done that for 60 years. It's time to sort of move on, I think. And we could say this is a non-scientific abstraction of how a stereo recording captures the source. Everything is squashed down into a muddy grey, which we can't really distinguish out of the nice phantom listening position. But there are new options, and that is to record the sound field with an ambisonics microphone, preferably a higher order ambisonics microphone. And this is an eigen mic, and it records 3D sound at a reasonably high resolution. It's 32 capsules in the microphone. There's a new one being made now which has 64 capsules, which is going to be very exciting. Comes out at Christmas. Christmas present. And so it allows us to record the landscape in 360 degrees in high resolution. And what I think is exciting here is that it allows the composer to pluck out or isolate sounds and their directions within that sound field. So not only do I know, okay, I hear the sound of a dog, I know the direction that it's in, and I can isolate that there as a mono stream out of that sound field. I've got source, and I've got a numerical description of its space. And that starts to get exciting, I think. So this is the non-scientific abstraction, more akin to the sound field captured by the eigen mic. So here's the listening position, and now I start to understand the propagations of the sounds. So if they are low-frequency sounds further away, they're going to spread out throughout the environment compared to the high-frequency sound that's close by, which will be more directional and so forth. We start to get a clearer depth and spatial picture of the world around us in the recording. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just simply say I'm going to play some examples, and I'm going to show you how I've used beamforming, which is a way of plucking out these sounds and then recomposing with them. So I'm going to jump out of that. And this time, I think I am going to show you, if I can look at the same time. Can I look at this? Yeah, okay. I'm going to try to show you something and play blindly and not see it myself. Let's turn on OSC. Yeah, okay. Let's cross our fingers this is going to work. Yes, okay. So, right, excellent. I'm first going to play you now an eigen mic recording, which has already been transcoded into ambisonics, fourth order 3D ambisonics. Oops, that's the whole thing. Squashed down to 2D third order of 8 loudspeakers here in Trondheim and in Oslo. So it's still not as great as the original recording, but you see it's kind of spacious. So this is just the recording.
Sorry.
Okay, you get the idea. You're outdoors. I hope you understand there's a table tennis game going on. There are other sounds there as well, things that you haven't yet heard either in the recording. Okay, so I'm going to now mute that. I'm not going to play it anymore. And instead, I'm going to play back some re-spatialized beams. Now remember, because I know the direction of these sounds, I can put my very, very precise ambisonics encoding over the top of my kind of less precise recording and make this hyper-real picture. Whereas a composer, then I can go off in any direction I want to. So here goes. I will show you this, just so you get a little idea of the background. So each of these dots is a beam extracted from the eigen mic recording. I'm not sending sound to them all the time as we're listening. So I'm not going to show you this while I'm playing, because you might get confused. But just so you understand that, OK, I've got all these mono points, and I'm able to then overlay them into other images. OK, so let's get rid of that. So you listen and don't look. And here goes. I'm going to play the first couple of minutes, and you'll understand how things can unfold. This is all real-time encoding and decoding now.
I'm so sorry. No more.
Tuna. Für dich. Sicher.
Sorry. Must do all the contestants.
Sicher.
I'm going to stop there because time is ticking, ticking, clicking. Well, you get the idea. Salient sounds in the sound field, I can now pick them out. So actually I've got a table tennis, actually balls on left and right, also hits a net in the middle, metal net. There's female voices, there's 3 different male voices, there's a dog barking, there's a child crying, there's a few birds in the trees. All these things can be taken out and manipulated. I know where they are in space. I also know how they're behaving in space. I know that the ball is static, on there, but sometimes it actually does go donk, 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 and I have that spatial trajectory, which I could then impose on another sound. The birds, well, I know where they are. They're up in the trees. They don't have to stay in the trees. I can develop them and put them somewhere else later. So the point is that it allows us to pick something apart. So what I've tried to present then is a way of working with sound, where at the beginning I'm showing how we can build up an image that is akin to the real world, not only in its size and mass, but how it could actually behave, and have this idea of gait from Sepehr. And then at the other end of the spectrum, saying we can take a complex sound field and decompose it, and then have the freedom to play around with what this sound field then offers to us. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We have 5 minutes, I think, for any questions.
We have time for one from each city.
Hi. Thank you, Natasha, for presentation. I was just curious about 2 things, actually. First, Do you rely completely on distance processing in SPAT, or do you use other tools for that?
Now I don't know. When I first started experimenting with this, then I used the distance processing in SPAT because it's a pretty good model actually. But if you want to go against the acoustic norms, then it gets a bit more tricky. And so now I pick it apart into different layers. And then process that individually separately. Yeah. Sometimes you want to turn off things. Sometimes you want to have a different kind of logarithmic scaling, for example, and so forth.
And the other quick question: when you have this, multi-channel sound files, how do you process them? With what kind of tools?
Multi-channel sound files. Well, hold on a minute. Why are they? Tell me why you think they're multi-channel sound files.
How? On what stage kind of do you do the processing?
Right. This is the last piece. I did extract from the last piece I played. What I have here is 43 monostreams of sound and layers of numerical data describing the spatial disposition. That is then being encoded in this piece in real time into higher-order ambisonics. The reason I worked in this way for this piece is because I needed to have this piece also in WFS, which has to be in real time, and a version for the Haghighi loudspeaker, which also kind of had to be in real time. I don't normally work like that.
So you render the single sources first, and then you process.
Normally, that's all in real time. So there's actually encoding and decoding in real time happening in this piece. In the previous piece I played, I do as much as I can first in real time, and when my CPU runs out, which it does very quickly, then because I have a slow computer, but computers are always too slow, right? Then I render the sound file in higher order ambisonics and start mixing HOA sound files in, for example, Reaper. And sometimes I then process the HOA sound file, because then you find, oh, maybe if we pitch shift it down an octave, some things are revealed from the encoded pitch shifting than you would have done in the original encoding. But you've got to be careful. You can't really transform ambisonic sound files without destroying the sound field. There are plugins which allow you to, or methods which allow you to sort of spread the information or contract it in different dimensions and different ways of transforming the spherical harmonics once they've been encoded. But they do tend to make the sound field messier rather than clearer. So I try not to do that. I try to get that right to start off with. But there's a point where CPU runs out and I have to mix encoded files.
Okay, what about, hello, Oslo, hello, Anne, can you hear us? And can we hear you?
Oh, they can hear us, I hope. Yes, they should hear us.
Otherwise,
Can't hear you, Oslo. Okay, yeah, we can see that you hear us, but we can't hear you.
Are we good then? So, I mean, we can post a question on the chat, or otherwise, yeah.
Where's their microphone?
Question in the chat, otherwise we just, okay, yeah. Otherwise we ping pong the question back to Trondheim. Is that okay? Is that okay? Yes, okay.
All right, one more, yeah.
In most of the examples you were giving here, it's acousmatic music, but
Absolutely.
you also do live electronics, as
Absolutely.
you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then the problem with CPU becomes a real issue.
I think there's a bigger problem, a far bigger problem than CPU with live electronics. Your eyes tell you how to listen. That's a much bigger problem than CPU. And but if you I think it's the visual aspect means you have to think differently. Because if your eyes say there's a person performing in front of you and you've got all this stuff around, your eyes are still listening from there. Really, whatever you do, you've really got to think, how am I going to work with my sound space when my eyes are telling me to listen? It's the same problem in cinema, of course, as well. But if you think about CPU, I have pieces which were made sort of 20 years ago where lots of live electronics, 2 fast Macintoshes of the time, very dodgy CPU levels. Now I could do it on my slowest laptop. Things change. and you find fixes to reduce CPU level. I must say, in live electronics and live performance, there's a lot you can get away with when it comes to quality and resolution, which you can't get away with acousmatic music, because people can't listen to it again and again. When they listen to it again and again, they do it on the CD recording, which has been perfected in the studio. So there's a lot of shortcuts in live electronics that you can't do in acousmatic music for saving CPU, aspects to do with quality, resolution, and so forth. So there are fixes there. But as I say, I think the biggest problem is that the eyes tell you how to listen, and you've got to find a way to incorporate that into your aesthetic.
Okay, so I think it's time for closing the session.
Okay.
But thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Natasha. Let's please thank you.